Hello everyone, welcome to the webinar on 9 yards of PCI PIN security. Thanks to all of you for taking time for joining this 1 hour webinar from SISA Information Security. We are glad to have you all and participate in this webinar. This is one of our monthly series webinar which we do in terms of sharing some of the information and our experiences with respect to payment security. Being a payment security specialist firm, we believe this is our way of understanding and also disseminating some of the information that we get to see as well as learn in our course of work. So thanks for taking time off and I have Renju Verghese with me, who's my colleague at SISA, and we keep doing these webinars every month, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the housekeeping issues before we get started. If you have any questions during this next hour or so, please feel free to type it into the chat window, which is on the right hand side of your screen. If you have any questions, at the we will definitely have some time, 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the webinar, if you are able to cover the content earlier, to answer any of your questions. But if you feel that the question can be answered during the webinar, I would we would try to answer that during the course. And then in case you face any technical challenges, please feel free to write to marketing@sisainfosec.com. Just as all our webinars, this webinar is also running full. So in case you face any technical challenges, please write to marketing@sisainfosec.com, and we'll try our best to get that sorted out. But thanks for this overwhelming support for this webinar. We are happy to hear from you for any future topics that you would want us to consider for our webinar as well. So the agenda for this webinar that we have is trying to give a 2-minute dump on what is PCI PIN, what the standard is what is the standard all about, and what actually is PIN for that matter, and how does that kind of affect PCI, as well as why is there a need for a new standard altogether, which is the PCI PIN security standards. We would also talk a little bit about what is the compliance mandate as far as PCI PIN is considered once we understand what PCI PIN is all about. We would then get into and explain the entire audit and compliance process with respect to PCI PIN, the entire workflow. And then we would jump into the security requirements. We'll give you an overview. Being a webinar, obviously, we are limited in terms of time. But I'm sure Renju and I will try to do our best in terms of giving you an overview of what the PCI PIN security requirements are and how that can help us secure our organizations. And what are the focus areas if you were to, if you are being subjected to an audit, or if you want to actually meet this PCI PIN security standards, what are the focus areas that you need to keep? And of course, the 10 key points that you need to keep in mind when you need to meet the PCI PIN security requirements. So the basic understanding of PCI PIN security standards is what we are trying to achieve in this webinar. That's the core objective of today's webinar. Few disclaimers as well. One, just to highlight, the PCI PIN security standard is managed and developed, of course, developed by Visa, and then now is being managed by the PCI PIN Security Standards Council. It is it's the standards body which owns the standard. So we would be referring to that standard. The names of the organizations, in case there is questions on this being a public forum, we would request not to ask any specific or a question which is pertinent to your company. Neither would we be talking to anything on any particular organization in specific. Being an assessor, we would not be able to share anything on a particular organization. But nevertheless, when we mention a name, or if at all we mention the name of an organization, is just to give an example. So we are not considering anything positive or negative on that particular organization or any names that we bring out during this webinar. The other thing is the opinions and thoughts expressed during this webinar are those are of our personal opinion and not that of the company SISA. So that's a few disclaimers that we need to run through before we get into the slides. On ourselves, my name is Darshan Shantamurthy. I work as the Chief Executive Officer of the company, and glad to be here along with Renju Verghese, who's the Principal Consultant. He also happens to be the Visa-approved PIN Security Assessor. And from a company standpoint, we are also proud that we are one of the Visa's approved security assessors, one of the few in this part of the world. And we are trying to do our bit in terms of securing the organizations that exist and our customers out here in Asia and Middle East. Over to you, Ranju. You could get started, and then in between, I would interject if I have some questions or points to add. Okay.
Sure. Thanks, Devious. Thanks for the introduction. So let's start with on what is PIN. So all of you might know that PIN is basically the four-digit number that you get that will be using for either doing an ATM transaction or in case if you're doing any post transaction using the debit cards. So that's the four-digit PIN. But you might also know that there are different kinds of PIN. That's the first kind of PIN is basically the debit card PIN, which we use for the ATM transactions. Then we have the chip and the PIN. That's the chip cards that we have. So once you insert the chip card into a POS terminal, then you have to enter the PIN for validating the card. And in some banks or some of the mobile banking application, we have the mobile PIN or the M-PIN, which is mainly used for authenticating a mobile banking transaction. And not in India, but me in abroad, for some of the credit cards that we have, those credit card also might have a PIN for authenticating a transaction. So what we even though there are various different types of PIN that's across in the industry, the focus area for this webinar and the PCI PIN is basically the debit card PIN. That's the PIN that we use for mainly authorizing or authenticating ourselves for a debit card transaction. The PCI PIN doesn't cover the chip and PIN standard, as it is mainly governed by the EMB standard. Now, the question that most of my colleagues ask when we went for PCI PIN is that why it is so important that the PCI has to bring a new standard on PCI PIN. We already have the PCI DSS standard, which talks about protecting the card number and debit card number. Then why should be there another standard for specific for the PIN? Let me tell you, the main reason the PCI Council had a new standard on PCI PIN is that PIN is a very sensitive information. Just imagine, let's imagine that we have a credit card and a debit cards. In case of a credit card gets stolen or there's a fraudulent transaction, then as a cardholder, our risk is limited, very much limited, because it is up to the merchant to it's up to the merchant to make sure that it was the right cardholder and he has done all the authentic validation of the cardholder and stuff. But in case a debit card and a PIN is stolen, then it actually leads to a actual withdrawal of money, and it also becomes very difficult to prove that it was a fraudulent transaction. Reason being that the PIN is basically a unique value known only to the cardholder and not to anyone else. So in case if you are lost your debit card and a PIN, and some of the fraudsters used your debit card for doing a fraudulent transaction, then it becomes very difficult for you to do a reverse chargeback or a chargeback on the same, because the PIN should be known only to you and not to anyone else. So that's the reason why the PCI have constituted a new standard just mainly focused on how to protect the PIN during the transaction as well as during the processing as well.
One point to note, Renju, is as we see, I mean, since we have a lot of audience from Asia and India as well, so in specific. So one of the things that we see is in India, debit cards are used more extensively than credit cards. I mean, there are more debit cards in circulation than credit cards.
Yes,
So the risk of PIN is also something that needs to be addressed in a bigger way. Do you think so?
that's right. Because we'll just talk about how the PIN transaction flows, and then I'll be able to show what it is. Good. Sure. So, mm,
Right. So, with respect to what is PCI PIN, so one of the things that you might want to actually talk about is what is the standard all about at the end of the day. What is PCI PIN security standard? And what are the requirements? You can just give a overall view of it, and then we'll probably look up the slide and explain how the PIN transaction essentially works.
sure. So, PCI PIN is basically is basically a standard that's been governed by the PCI Council. Earlier, it was called as the Visa PIN Security Standard, and as with the PCI and the other standards, all the standards were either a Visa or a Mastercard standard, and then it was adopted into the PCSC fold. So uh, that's the thing. So the PCI PIN earlier was called the Visa PIN standard, and it was mainly driven by the Visa for protecting their acquirers and all those their transactions. So in that case, then what used to happen was that once the entity is PCI certified, or like the early days of the PCI DSS, they wanted to bring it into one umbrella so that it can be referred by anyone who's doing both Visa and Mastercard or Amex or any JCB Discover transaction. So that's how the PCI PIN came into picture, while the PCI SSC adopted the standard from the Visa, which was an earlier Visa standard.
Right. So the way it, I think you're spending a little more time in explaining how the ATM pin essentially is generated. So we could probably spend some time explaining how the pin is actually generated. So one of the things that essentially happens is that one is the issuing component, and the second is the acquiring component, which essentially gets acquired from the ATM, where the pin gets acquired from the ATM. And second is one of the issuing. The second is the issuing component. As far as issuing of the PIN is concerned, there is the PIN which gets generated as part of the card issuance mechanism, which is which is something that we need to consider when we come into the compliance mode, because when we look at the Visa's PIN security mandate, they talk about the acquiring component, not so much as on the issuing side. So understanding how the PIN essentially comes in for a bank or for a processor, that's an important component. So we have the acquiring component, which comes from the ATM, wherein actually you go to an ATM, you insert your card into an ATM, and then you enter the PIN. Then actually what actually happens is then there is a PIN block which gets generated, which is then encrypted and then sent out to the ATM controllers or the acquiring component of it before being pushed onto the payment brand and then onto the issuing for authentication. And then there is a transaction which comes back to the success or failure is sent back to the ATM client or the ATM or any the issuing or basically the point of sale terminal or the ATM for that matter. So the acquiring component covers right from the time that you actually have the ATM up till the fact that it goes to the acquirer, to which it gets pin translated. That means at the end of the day there are keys which gets which needs to be deployed in order to encrypt right from the time the ATM actually reads or gets the PIN up to the way up to the acquirer when PIN gets translated and then gets decrypted and re-encrypted and then sent on to the payment brand or the interchanges which we call, and then onto the issuer. So that's how the PIN essentially comes into picture, and the acquiring component actually covers that piece. And the issuing part is when the PIN is actually generated for the cardholder, and then the PIN is actually given out to the cardholder for the purposes of for transactions. So that's the issuing component. So that's something that we need to cover. One is the acquiring, and the second is the issuing component.
Sure. Sure. Um, Fine. Thanks, Davies. So that's how the payment transaction actually flows. So if you see, mainly, if you, as Davies has explained, the PIN gets encrypted within the ATM PIN pad itself, and gets decrypted at the server side. Sure. Now, coming back to the what is the PIN, it's basically a set of a complete set of requirements on for how to securely manage secure management processing and the transmission of the PIN data during online and offline transactions. Basically, there are the focus area of the PCI PIN is mainly on the kind of devices that is used for PIN transaction, the key management of on how the key should be used for driving the transaction, and what are the devices used for key management, and how are the keys are getting injected into the PED devices, etc. The standard basically consists of around 33 requirements, which can be divided into 7 logical related groups. So, uh, apart from the 7 groups, there are apart from that all the 32 requirements have a lot of sub requirements, and if you see all the PCI requirement, then there are in total of around 350 requirements, including both Appendix A and Appendix B. Um, what's Appendix A? Basically, Appendix A is a set of requirements which mainly talks about how the key should be loaded, in case if they're looking out for any remote key loading feature. And Appendix B is basically a specific set of requirements which needs to be implemented if the entity is conducting any key injection to the post terminals, etc. So in Appendix B, we have specific controls, like there has to be a specific room for the key injection process. There has to be specific systems for key injection, etc. So that's the mainly on the PCI PIN requirement. Sure. So the currently there were two versions of the standard, and the version 2 is which needs to be adhered to. Now look into the PCI PIN requirements. The objective, if you see, we have, as I said, we have around 7 objectives of the entire PCI PIN requirements, and out of it, the objective one mainly revolves around on the type of devices which is used for PIN transaction, like the PIN entry device, HSM. So, as per the requirement of PCI PIN, the PED of the HSM has to be a PCI PTS certified devices. So, in case PCI PTS is PCI PIN Transaction Security. So this is specific certification which is required for the hardware terminals. So every hardware that can be needs to be used for a PIN transaction has to be audited and certified by specific PCI PTS labs. Uh, PCI PTS labs. So that's for the PED device. So if you see all the ATMs, all the ATM pin entry pads, the card readers. If you have seen any mobile post transaction, then the card readers, all those devices has to be PCI PTS certified devices. While in case of an HSM, which is the host security module, as per the requirement, the HSM has to be either a PCI PTS certified device or has to be a FIPS level 2 compliant level 2 compliant. So that's on the objective one of the PCI pins standard. The objective two mainly talks about on how the key should be generated. So basically, for the entire pin transaction, there are set of keys like the LMKs, TMKs, that is the local master key, which is used for the HSM. We have the TMK, which is the terminal master key, TPK, terminal pin encryption key, ZMK, ZPK, etc. So there are various sets of keys which is required as part of PCI pin, and the objective two mainly talks about on how this key should be generated. So it clearly specifies that it has to be generated using a pseudo random function, and we need to use a PCI PTS approved device for generating the keys. In that sense, we need to either use an HSM or another hardware module for generating all these sets of keys. And the requirement even goes in specific, which says that not only generation, as per the thing, we need to have unique key for each terminals. So in that sense, that means that if we have around 50,000 ATMs or post terminals, then the acquirer who's going to manage all those terminals needs to have around 50,000 unique TMKs or TPKs. That's a big set of keys that needs to be managed by the acquirer. But but that can be taken care if I implemented DUKPT, which is a derived unique key per transaction. Then instead of managing keys for each terminal, the acquirer just need to maintain only one specific key, that is the base derivation keys. That's on the objective 2, which talks about the key generation and having unique keys. The objective 3 mainly talks about how the key should be transmitted or transported. It talks about that the keys should be basically split into at least two key components, and once the key components are entered, then it should be XORed together for getting the final set of key. So let me explain. So in case if you're going to enter the keys into an ATM device, then the ATM installation team will have two sets of key components. So the key component 1 will be entered by the key custodian 1, and key component 2 will be entered by key custodian 2. And once both the key components are entered, then the ATM PED device or the ATM pin entry device will XOR both the components together for getting the ATM keys. That's either the that's the terminal master key. So so the objective tree mainly talks about saying that once the keys are generated, it has to be in two different key components and should be securely transmitted to the third party. So, for example, if we're going to generate the TMKs, that is terminal master keys, then the HSM should directly print that keys into a kind of a pin mailer envelope. A pin mailer envelope is something which we may get for getting to know your PIN once you get a debit card or a credit card. So in those kind of PIN mail envelope, the keys has to be printed, and only at time of entry should that PIN envelope should be opened and the key should be entered. Now, one of the questions that will come up across is that why there should be so much security that you need to implement for this key management. Well, if you have understood the ATM flow, the keys gets the pin or the pin block gets encrypted at the pin entry device itself. And at any point of time, if that keys which is being used for encrypting the device is known, then the entire transaction which flows through the channel can get compromised. So that's the reason why there's very specific importance has been given on how the keys are generated, and very much emphasis is given on how the keys are transmitted or conveyed to the key custodians. The objective 4 mainly talks about on how the keys should be loaded into the HSM or the pin entry device. The requirement talks about having at least two key custodians for entering the keys, and they should enter their key components separately, and it should the device should then exert the key components together for getting the keys. While the objective 5 of the standard talks about the controls that should be in place for preventing and detecting any kind of key compromise or any unauthorized use of keys. That's objective 5. While objective 6 talks about that how should the keys should be administered in a secure manner. While the objective and the objective last not the least, the objective 7 talks about on how we should secure the devices that's been used for the pin and key management. So basically talks about on how should the pin entry device should be managed. If you're using a key loading device, then how should the key loading device should be managed and secured, etc. So that's basically the 7 objectives of PCI PIN standard. And these 7 objectives, there are around 33 requirements for all these 7 objectives, and including the sub requirements and Appendix A and Appendix B, there are around 350 requirements in the entire PCI PIN security standard. Now, I just give to DBS for explaining the compliance for PCI PIN.
Thanks, Ranju. So why do we need to meet with? Why do we need to comply with the PCI PIN standards? We need to meet. We need to comply with the PCI PIN security standards because one of the payment brands, which is Visa, in specific, has made it mandatory that all acquirers, at the end of the day, the acquiring component of it has to go through and undergo a PCI PIN security audit before 31st of December 2015, which ends in a couple of months. So yes, the PCI PIN is now a mandate that essentially needs to be adhered to by organizations across the globe. And this mandate applies to Visa Inc., which largely covers all Visa entities except, of course, Visa Europe, which has a different mandate. Earlier to in the year 2013, up to 2013, the PCI PIN was earlier driven through a self-assessment questionnaire, but now is required to be done by a Visa-approved Security Assessor, such as SISA. We've now been one of the Visa's approved Security Assessor, and we can conduct this security audits. We of course have gone through a list of requirements from Visa before we have gone this accreditation. So we are now one of the approved security assessors and the only ones in this part of the world as far as the Visa PIN security audit is concerned. One of the things, of course, which Renju also mentioned, PIN is the most coveted data as part of the sensitive authentication data. When you look at PCI, definitely it talks about PIN block or the PIN itself as one of the sensitive authentication data. So any breach of PIN can lead to a major compromise. Needless to say that debit card transactions are on the rise, and even here, we've seen many of the merchants actually use PIN as a way to authenticate. So nowadays, you also see, the additional factor authentication on an online transaction becoming an ATM PIN, which is traditionally not the case when you actually do a brick and mortar purchase, like going to a mall or going to a shop and swiping your card. But now you see ATM PIN being also being used as an authentication factor in online transactions. I've seen a couple of merchants use that. But then being such a coveted data, you are seeing that actually getting processed in online transactions when you have internet or e-commerce portals or e-commerce applications processing that PIN and then forwarding this to the ATM switch for authentication. So how how the pins are actually being dealt with becomes a very important thing, and PCI PIN security standard does help. And then of course PCI standards also come into picture when it actually applies to these kinds of organizations when they deal with the card data. Um, the encryption definitely is as strong as its keys. So PCI PIN audit covers how keys should be managed, and that's what Renju spoke all about so far. That why is key management so important? And then you would see a lot of emphasis of the PCI PIN security standards being on PIN, and how do you actually manage the keys, the data encryption keys, the key management keys, and the entire the entire processing and the key translate the pin translation that essentially happens when you decrypt and then re-encrypt the key before it actually gets processed to the next chain. So security. So why would one want to comply with the PCI PIN security standards? Definitely because of the growing use of PIN as a form of authentication factor, not just for the ones which Renju said, but wherein you just have a PIN being used for the debit cards, but every transaction where PIN is actually coming into use. And then of course business risks largely lie with the fact that PIN, the issuing process, the PIN is built in such a way that the PIN is only known to the card holder. Even the issuing bank does not keep the PIN in clear. They usually have something called the PIN offset. So compromise of a PIN can be very disastrous to the entire system if the pins were to be get compromised. And we are seeing PIN being used in a very extensive manner in for all transactions. So obviously, for if there was to be a fraud or if there was to be a compromise of the PIN, then it would lead to heavy financial loss. And then the fact that it also affects the brand reputation of the payment brands or of the organization if it gets compromised is one major thing which applies across board.
Sure. So the one question that always comes up is that why do we need both PCI DSS and PCI PIN security? Well, the main reason is that PCI DSS mainly talks about how to protect the card number. So it doesn't. It only says that PIN or PIN block should not be stored. There is no specific emphasis on how the PIN or how the keys which is used for encrypting the PIN should be generated, stored, processed, etc. So as we do the lot of assessments for banks and everyone, if you see or if you're going through PCI standard, it has never emphasized on the PIN security at all. So if you take example, even though we say that okay, in an ATM machine, the logs or the EJ file should not contain the PIN block, it never goes that okay, every ATM terminal should have a unique terminal master key. It does not goes into these details. So that's the reason why the PCI have the PCI PIN security standard constituted. Other reason is that PCDS has been a is a standard which needs to be compliant for banks, merchants, service providers across. They cannot put specific emphasis on the PIN transaction because the PCI PIN only applies to the acquirers, the service providers who manage the ATMs and post terminals, etc. So that's the reason why there's a different standard for managing the PCI PIN and not just one PCI DSS. Um, so the other question that comes up is that if I do a PCI audit, will it cover as part of PCI PIN? The answer is definitely no. PCI covers on how to protect the card number, while the PCI PIN mainly talks about how to protect the keys that's been used for a PIN transaction. And the question like vice versa, that if I'm PCI PIN certified, will I meet PCI DSS? Well, it will be helpful. It will definitely help in your PCI DSS certification. But if you are PCI PIN certified, you cannot claim that you're PCI DSS certified. These are both different set of standards and has to be audited and certified on separate basis. Yeah.
Yeah. So one other point to add is definitely PCI and PCI DSS and PCI PIN are complementary standards. That means they work hand in hand with each other, just like how PCI DSS and EMV works together. In the sense, one is with PCI PIN is focused towards key management and is a lot more detailed. If you look at requirement 3.5 and 3.6 of the PCI DSS standard, it does cover the key management component of it. But if you look at the PCI PIN security standard, it kind of blows up the requirement 3.5 and 3.6 of the PCI DSS standard and kind of enumerates in detail the entire key management processes that has to be followed, including the physical properties of key security or PIN security that needs to be taken care of. So that's how both of them work hand in hand with respect to protecting the entire card transaction, including, of course, PCI PIN focuses on the PIN. PCI DSS is a lot more, which includes the PIN, but PIN is just one component or one data element which is covered in PCI.
Sure. Well, then the question comes that do I need PCI PIN? Well, if you fall under any of these specific categories, then you need PCI PIN. So basically, do you acquire any transaction? Are you an acquirer or a service provider who acquires transaction, either an ATM or a post transaction? Then yes, you need to be compliant with PCI PIN. Or if you are a issuer, if you're going to issue cards on your behalf of your clients, or as a bank are going to issue cards, then as an issuer you also need to comply with PCI PIN. But as it, the- as part of a PCI, the entire compliance is mainly driven by Visa. So the compliance requirement is will be mainly to the VisaNet processors who does the acquiring transaction. So the deadline which you mentioned about December 2015 is mainly for the VisaNet processors who process the ATM transactions. And one component is that if you are more of a service provider is going to do key injection on behalf of the banks, then PCI PIN will become applicable to you. For example, if you're managing the terminals like the EDC terminals or the post terminals, and you inject the keys to the terminals and give the terminals back to the bank to be dispatched to the merchants, then as a key injection facility, you need to get certified as part of PCI PIN standards.
Right. One is, of course, the mandate which is laid out, because as a interchange Visa, I mean, as a payment brand, Visa would obviously, or any of the payment brands would be duty bound to protect the acquiring component of it. But it would be in the interest of any issuing or the issuing processor to take care of the issuing component of PCI PIN as well, which is one of the additions that you need to consider when you actually do PCI PIN. So while the mandate or the requirement from Visa would be to cover the acquiring component, if you are an issuer or if you do anything with issuing, it would make a lot of sense for you to use the same PCI PIN standards, but also run it through your internal for your issuing component as well, and not just on the acquiring component.
Sure. Now, just to go through the PCI PIN security audit workflow. So the entire assessment or the entire certification process is divided into mainly two phases. One is the pre-audit, which is basically an offsite review that we do. So the pre-audit can be an on-site or an off-site audit as well. So in case in the pre-audit, we ensures that most of the controls or most of the documentations is in place, all those stuff. So as part of our consulting process, we do the pre-audit on-site to ensure that if you have any if you have not implemented PCI PIN, then we'll be able to help you out in implementing the PCI PIN on the controls and what has to be done, all those stuff as part of the pre-audit. So once the pre-audit is been completed, then the actual audit happens. That's the on-site audit phase. And for the on-site audit, please note that only a Visa-approved security assessor can come on-site for doing an on-site audit for the PCI PIN security requirements. So the on-site audit will consist of going through all the 350 controls, opening up the switch, the source code of the switch to review how the switch talks to the HSM, seeing the HSM configuration on whether it's been configured securely, reviewing the logs, the application logs, reviewing the various processes that we have for key management, etc. Now, as part of the once the on-site audit is completed, we'll be issuing something called as the PCI PIN Security Audit Report, which will contain details like what are the non-compliance points with respect to the entire standard, and so let's assume that if there is a lot of non-compliance points for the standard, then the decision is that whether there are major NCs or minor NCs. So if there are major NC points, then again after the remediation of this NC point, again it will come for an on-site audit, and the process will follow. But in case it's only a minor NC point, NCs are observed, then it can be done, an offsite validation can be done through screenshot and everything else. And the final deliverables will be something called as the Visa Attestation of Compliance, or VAOC. So if you have gone through the PCI, PCI DSS, as part of PCI DSS certification, we issue something called as the AOC, or Attestation of Compliance. And as part of PCI PIN, the deliverables is the Visa Attestation of Compliance, or VAOC, and definitely our PCI PIN certificate as well.
Right, fantastic, Ranju. So I know there are lots of questions which are coming by. We will take them, as we get closer to the end of the session, so that we can take it at one shot. So keep those questions, typed into the chat window, and we'll take as many questions as we can in the last 10 minutes of the webinar.
Sure. Now, the thing is, what are the key focus areas that we do in the PCI PIN? So, key focus area is definitely on the key management, as you may be knowing. So, there are, as you know, there are the various keys like the HSM local master key, Visa master key, Visa acquiring keys, zonal master keys, terminal master keys, section keys. So, the audit will be focused on how are these keys generated, stored, rotated, or destroyed. The entire key management lifecycle for all the set of keys. That is the main focus area. Then the second area will be on the HSM management, on how the HSM is configured. If you have ever got a chance to go through an HSM, unless the HSM is properly configured, all the security features provided by HSM cannot be used at all. Then, in case of acquiring transactions, then we'll be going through the code review of the switch on basically how the switch interacts with the HSM for key management. We'll also be reviewing the switch transaction logs to ensure that the pin block or the keys are not getting captured in the debug logs. Please note that in 95% of cases that you have seen, the switch will be storing the pin block, the encrypted pin block. So if you are a bank and if you have a switch in place, please go through the incoming interface, the ATM incoming interface, and there'll be the debug logs that will be captured. And if you review the logs, it might be in the ISO 853 messaging format, which has around 62 fields. And in specific, if there's in the field 52, if there is any data, then you can be rest assured that the PCI pin or the encrypted pin block is getting stored in your debug logs. So repeat, go through your switch debug logs, and especially for the incoming transaction, review the field 52. That is in the ISO 8583 format. Review the field 52, and if there is data on that field 52, then it is the encrypted pin block. Then once we review the logs, then comes to the key loading. We'll be mainly focused on how the keys are loaded into terminal, and the entire key loading process will be reviewed. So, as an entity, what are the main 10 essential points that we need to ensure for meeting the PCI PIN requirements? Definitely, first one is to ensure that we have a proper key management process in place. That's the first most important criteria. If you don't have anything, you can always contact us, and we'll be able to help you out in preparing the proper key management process document for you, or process in place. Second is that we use the proper PIN formats. So, if you are an acquirer or an issuer, you'll be knowing that there are a lot of various ISO PIN formats that's been there. That's ISO format 0, ISO format 1, 2, etc. For PCI PIN, we have to ensure that we use ISO format 0 for authenticating and validating the pins. The other is that with third essential point is that we should have proper key custodians assigned for each of the key management function. In that sense, if there should be at least two key custodians for every set of keys, whether it's going to be the LM case or the zonal master key. We have to have proper key custodians, and the key custodians cannot be from the same department. It has to be from two different departments. So in essential, if one key custodian is from the IT, then the other key custodian should be from the card divisions. The fourth point, we need to ensure that the all devices like the HSMs and the all the devices like the HSMs, the PED devices are checked regularly for any kind of tampering. Especially the focus will be on the EDC terminals or the post terminals, because that are the devices where there's been a lot of tampering that has been happened. Even your ATMs. So in Middle East there was a fraud that had happened last year, when the malicious user had put a keylogger, means a physical keylogger, on top of the pin pad, and when the customers used to enter the pin, it was used to capture the pin and as well as the track to data as well. So we need to do a regular review of all the devices which is used for PCI PIN. The fifth point is we have to ensure that the key loading operations are handled in a much secure manner. Key loading, so if you have a physical key loading, then you have to ensure that we have a separate physical room, specific system that can be only used for key loading, etc. What we suggest for this point is that emphasize for remote key loading feature, so that there's very less manual intervention, and it's mainly driven through the application. Six is transmission and conveyance of the keys must be handled securely. In the sense, if we have the let's say going to transfer the keys from one bank to the Visa or to the other banks, then you have to ensure that we use out of band technologies for transmitting the keys. Yes, uh, PIN must be stored only for the required time. That's the standard. But what we suggest is that PIN should not be stored at all. It has to be in what the PCI PIN states that in case if there is any uh, downtime or store and forward transactions, then PIN can be stored. But what he suggests is that these days stored and forward transaction is very less, so you don't need to retain PIN at all. The crypto gives the 8.8 says that how the key should be generated, and the standard clearly emphasizes that it has to be generated using a pseudo random function and has to be generated from a PCI PTS certified device. It also gives more importance that even if you're going to use an hardware, there has to be at least two individuals who will be present at the time of the key generation process. 9 talks about in case if we are going to encrypt the keys during the transport, then the key encryption key must be at least strong as that of the keys that's been transmitted or conveyed. And as usual, for all the controls that we put in place, we need to have proper process documented.
All right, so now is a good time to actually take questions. Thanks, Renju. I think we're just about time. We have 10 more minutes, so we can start taking questions. The first question that we have is: is the PIN encrypted or hashed? Any point during the transaction flow, does the PIN get stored anywhere? So I'll repeat the question. Is the PIN encrypted or hashed? And at any point during the transaction flow, does the PIN get stored anywhere? Renju, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So, if you have understood the ATM transactions, the PIN doesn't get stored or stored anywhere, whether it's in encrypted format or in the hashed format. It's always generated on the fly. So what happens is that at the bank side, when the transaction hits the bank's switch, that is the ATM switch, it gives the PIN encrypted PIN block and the keys to the HSM. The HSM generates the PIN on the fly, compares the PIN which has been received from the ATM, and it compares, and if it's a valid PIN, it gives a response as a 1 back, otherwise it gives a response 0 back to the switch. So it, it for all the banks that's across the globe, the pins are always generated on the fly and compared with the pin which has been received. And it's been always done through a host security module. So at any point of time, the pin need not be stored either as an encrypted format or as the hashed format at all.
Thanks, Renju. Just to add to that, so the PIN, as we mentioned earlier, the issuing process of the PIN is in such a way that only the cardholder knows the clear text of the PIN. So the comparison of the issuing side is we're using the PIN offset to what Renju said, and then the success or failure message essentially gets going. That's a brilliant question. The next question that we have is if one is PCI DSS certified, can only are they only eligible to go for PCI PTS? That means that to rephrase the question, do I need to be PCI DSS certified in order to get PCI PIN audited? Is the question, I guess. Yeah.
No. As we mentioned earlier, both PCI DSS and PCI PIN are two different standards. So you can get audited for PCI PIN or PCI DSS, and there is no requirement that only a PCI DSS certified entity is to go for PCI PIN. An entity can go for PCI PIN even if they are not PCI DSS certified. The point that you have to remember is that if you are handling card number, you have to get PCI DSS certified, and if you're going to handle the PIN, then you have to get PCI PIN certified as well. So these two certifications, depending on your business environment.
All right. The next question is PCI PIN audit required for a service provider, or will they have to comply only with the PCI DSS? So just to repeat for the purpose of clarity, is PCI PIN audit required for a service provider, or will they have to comply only with the PCI DSS standards?
So depends on what kind of service provider is it. So for example, if you're a service provider which is going to handles the PIN, then you need to have both PCI DSS and PCI PIN. But if you're a service provider only handling the card number, then only PCI DSS certification is required. PCI PIN certification is not required.
All right. Thanks. I think those are some of the questions that we have got. The other questions that we have is who should comply to PCI PIN? Is it applicable to merchants, acquirers, or issuers? That is, who should comply to PCI PIN? Is it applicable to merchants, or is it for acquirers, or is it for issuers? Who is it applicable to?
So the PCI PIN is basically applicable to any entity which handles the PIN transaction. Mainly, it will be the acquirers and the issuers, or any service provider who is going to support the acquirers and the issuers. It is not applicable to the merchants level because the merchant gets the terminals from the acquirer and they just use it for their transaction. So, as an acquirer and issuer needs to go for the PCI PIN. Also, if you're an service provider who's going to manage the terminals, that's the EDC terminals, then and going to inject the keys into those terminals, then you need to comply with PCI PIN as well.
All right. The next question. I mean, we've got a lot of questions coming up. That's very good. Let me try to see the other question that we have here. Um, can can an OTP considered as a PIN? Can a one-time transaction, one-time password be considered a PIN? Let me take that. I mean,
Sure.
so OTP is not a PIN. A PIN, I mean, it cannot replace a PIN, and then it is not. I mean, if I were to rephrase that question, whether PCI PIN security standards apply to OTPs, not really. That's not that doesn't apply. Okay. The next question um, is PCI DSS certification not sufficient as an evidence that we are complying with PCI PIN keys or PIN security standards? That means, is PCI DSS certification not sufficient as an evidence for having complied with PCI PIN security? So I'll start with the partial answer, then you can complete that. As I mentioned earlier, the requirement 3 of the PCI DSS standards talks about protecting stored cardholder data. And under requirement 3, 3.5 and 3.6 are the one standards which talks about key management from an encryption standpoint. And 3.2 definitely talks about not storing sensitive authentication data post authorization. Now, the PCI DSS standards does cover keys, does covers PIN as one of the data elements. But having said that, the detailed processes which is entailed in terms of how how PIN should be handled in the entire transaction flow is not covered in PCI DSS, and hence PCI PIN security standards come into picture. So, Renji, you want to add to that?
I think you covered most of the point. So just to emphasize, if you see PCI DSS, the requirement 3.4 talks about encryption and the key management. The key management there mainly talks about on how the keys which are used for encrypting the card number needs to be handled. While the PCI PIN mainly talks about the key management with respect to on how the keys which are used for encrypting the PIN needs to be handled. Please note that the key management in the PCI standard, we can say, is less diluted when compared with the PCI PIN standard, because PCI PIN key management process is much stringent than what is there in the PCI DSS. That's the reason why even if we are PCI DSS certified, we still need to go for PCI PIN, and PCI certification won't suffice the requirement for PCI PIN because both are two different standards and the requirements are also different.
Right. So I think that's about time that we had for all the questions. Brilliant questions that we have got for this webinar. Just to round up this webinar, just a few mandatory slides on CISAs, just in case you haven't known us earlier. We are a PCI qualified security assessor in addition to being a PAQSA company. We are a point-to-point encryption qualified security assessors in addition to being a PCI PIN and a PCI ASV. We've been in this space for almost a decade now, and we have about four global delivery operations across the globe, and we've been one of the pioneers in respect to PCI or anything related to payment security across the globe. And one of the key things that we entail in our offerings is to actually have a citizen security approach, which includes combination of services, training, and products. We believe that that's the way we can actually reduce the cost of compliance and then improve security posture of the organization. So we combine. We run three popular programs. We have over 5,000 people certified on our flagship program, which is the Certified Payment Card Industry Security Implementer Program. We have a formal risk assessment workshop called the SISA, the only workshop of its kind, which includes all formal risk assessments from NIST, SP 830, Octave, and ISO 27005. And due to the rising security incidents that we have seen on applications being involved, we launched a program about 18 months back on something called the CPSID, which is focused towards developers. As you would all know that the PCI DSS requirement 6.1 and many other requirements of the 6 under sub requirements under 6 require the developers to be trained on payment card security. So that focus, the CPSID is focused towards that. And then of course we have our tool, data discovery tool, and our risk assessment products that are there in the marketplace. We thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate you getting logged in. We have had a full house for this webinar. This is one of our continued series where we have had webinars maxed out. So we really appreciate your time, and we will like to thank you for your time and look forward to your inputs and feedback. I would just run a short poll to get to know your feedback on the session. Please do rate this webinar. It will help us improve